There was no shouting, no theatrics, no dramatic entrance. Yet every person in that windowless briefing room felt the shift the moment Lieutenant Sarah Chun walked to the front of the table and placed her weathered field notebook beside the digital tactical display that had been projecting incorrect coordinates for the past 40 minutes. She didn't interrupt, didn't clear her throat for attention, just stood there with her hands resting lightly on the table's edge while Colonel Marcus Hendricks continued his assessment of the proposed infiltration route through the Helmand River Valley, a route that would, if executed as planned, lead a 12-man team directly into a known insurgent stronghold that intelligence had flagged 3 days prior. The room held 23 officers, ranging from captains to a 2-star general observing from the back corner, and not one of them had bothered to look up when she entered. Not even when she quietly corrected the map scale under her breath, a correction no one acknowledged because she was just a lieutenant, 28 years old, with a slight frame that made her look younger, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and the kind of face that senior officers glanced past on their way to more important conversations. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe to Stories of Sacrifice, so you never miss these powerful true stories of courage and sacrifice, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. But Sarah wasn't there for acknowledgement. She was there because 3 weeks earlier, she'd walked that exact valley, felt the elevation changes in her calves, noted the seasonal water levels that didn't match what satellite imagery suggested, and she knew with absolute certainty that the route Colonel Hendricks was proposing would put good men in a kill zone before they ever reached the objective. She stood perfectly still, her posture neither rigid nor casual, just centered. The way someone stands when they've learned that movement without purpose draws the wrong kind of attention, and her eyes, dark brown and unremarkable to anyone who didn't look closely, tracked the laser pointer as it highlighted Checkpoint Delta, a narrow ravine that appeared on the digital map as a straightforward passage but was, in reality, a seasonal flood channel that had claimed 2 vehicles and 5 local nationals just last spring. The thing about military briefing rooms is they have a hierarchy that's felt more than seen. It's in who sits where, who speaks first, who gets the nod to continue when 2 people start talking at once, and Lieutenant Chun knew her place in that hierarchy, knew it so well that she'd learned to navigate around it the way you navigate around furniture in a dark room, by memory and careful steps. She'd been at Forward Operating Base Lightning for 6 months, attached to an intelligence fusion cell that most line officers considered a dumping ground for personnel who couldn't hack it in combat arms. Never mind that her security clearance was 3 levels above most of the men in this room. Never mind that she spoke 4 languages including Pashto and Dari. Never mind that her performance evaluations used words like exceptional and invaluable, because those evaluations came from colonels and generals who weren't here, who didn't have to watch Colonel Hendricks dismiss her presence with the kind of casual disregard that's learned over decades of military service where women were secretaries and nurses, not tactical advisors. She'd grown used to it the way you grow used to a low-grade headache, annoying but manageable, and she'd learned that fighting every small battle left you exhausted and ineffective, so she picked her moments, waited for the times when being right mattered more than being heard, and this, right now, watching a colonel plan to send men into danger based on faulty intelligence and outdated maps, this was one of those moments. Colonel Hendricks was 52. A career infantry officer who'd done 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. A man who'd earned his Silver Eagle the hard way and believed that combat experience trumped book learning every single time. And he was holding court like he always did, voice confident and clear, using the kind of military jargon that separated the insiders from the outsiders. We'll insert here at 0300. Use the ravine for concealment and be in position before first light, he was saying, his pointer tapping the screen with authority. And around the table, heads nodded in agreement because disagreeing with a colonel in an open briefing required either courage or stupidity, and most officers had learned to save their objections for private conversations where rank couldn't be used as a weapon. Sarah watched a captain she knew, Rodriguez, shift in his seat, his eyes flicking to the map and then to her, and she saw the question there, saw that he'd noticed the same problem she had but wouldn't speak up because he was smart enough to know that questioning a colonel's tactical plan in front of a general was a career-limiting move. 3 other lieutenants sat along the wall, taking notes, trying to look engaged and professional, and she recognized in their faces the same careful neutrality she'd perfected. The mask you wore when you wanted to be taken seriously but knew that any sign of emotion, pride, anger, frustration would be used to confirm every stereotype about why women didn't belong in these spaces. The briefing room smelled like stale coffee and the recycled air of a modified shipping container, fluorescent lights humming overhead with that particular frequency that became background noise after a while, and the walls were covered in maps, intelligence reports, and a deployment timeline that stretched across 12 feet of whiteboard, marking objectives and milestones in red and blue and green. This was the nerve center of planning, where decisions got made that would ripple out into the lives of hundreds of soldiers, and everyone in this room knew it, felt the weight of it, which made what was about to happen either very important or very dangerous, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. Sarah's hands remained on the table, fingers spread slightly, not gripping, not tense, just present, and if you knew what to look for, if you'd spent time around people who'd been through selection courses and advanced training, You might have noticed that her hands showed signs of hard use, calluses in specific places, small scars across the knuckles, the kind of wear that doesn't come from typing reports or attending meetings. But no one was looking at her hands. They were looking at the map, at the colonel, at their own notes, anywhere but at the quiet lieutenant who'd positioned herself at the head of the table like she had something to say. Colonel Hendricks wrapped up his initial overview and opened the floor for questions, which was more formality than invitation because he'd already made his decision, and briefings like this were about disseminating orders, not soliciting input, but protocol required the gesture, so he made it, his eyes sweeping the room in a way that didn't really see anyone, just confirmed that everyone was paying attention. "Any questions or concerns?" he asked, his tone suggesting there better not be, and the room stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds before Sarah spoke, her voice calm and clear and utterly without deference. "Sir, I have significant concerns about the insertion route through checkpoint Delta," she said, and the room's attention shifted like a physical thing, every head turning toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to irritation to barely concealed amusement. Because who was this lieutenant, this woman who barely looked old enough to be out of college, to question a colonel's tactical plan? Hendrix's face did something complicated, a micro-expression that started as dismissal and ended as annoyance, and he turned to face her fully, crossing his arms across his chest in a posture that was pure dominance display. "Lieutenant, is it?" he asked, though he knew damn well who she was, had signed off on her assignment to the FOB himself. "Lieutenant Chun, sir," she replied, not backing down, not apologizing for speaking, just stating fact. "And your concern is based on what, exactly?" Hendricks asked, his voice dripping with the kind of patience you'd use with a child who'd interrupted an adult conversation. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't rush to justify herself, just reached down and opened her field notebook, the leather cover worn smooth from months of use, pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches and coordinates, the kind of analog record-keeping that seemed quaint in an age of digital everything but had the advantage of never running out of batteries or losing signal. "I conducted a ground reconnaissance of that area 3 weeks ago," she began, but Hendricks cut her off with a raised hand and a thin smile. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this route has been analyzed by our intelligence section using satellite imagery, drone footage, and reports from local informants. I think we can trust that assessment over a single ground patrol." The words "single ground patrol" landed like he intended them to, diminishing her observation, making it seem insignificant, and around the table, she saw officers relax slightly, returning to their notes, the moment of tension passing because the colonel had spoken and order had been restored. But Sarah wasn't done. She'd learned a long time ago that persistence matters more than permission, and she pressed forward, her voice still calm, still professional, but with an edge now, a hint of steel that made a few people look up again. "Sir, with respect, the satellite imagery is from dry season, and the drone footage doesn't show subsurface water flow, that ravine floods during spring runoff, it's impassable without specialized equipment. And right now, we're at the tail end of the melt, there's still significant water moving through there." She was giving him facts, clear and direct, but Hendricks wasn't interested in facts, he was interested in maintaining authority, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into that register that senior officers use when they want to end a discussion. "Lieutenant, I've been planning combat operations since before you were born. I think I can assess terrain without your input." The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when someone has just been publicly slapped down, and Sarah felt every eye on her, waiting to see if she'd push back or accept the dismissal, and for a long moment, she said nothing, just looked at the colonel with those dark, unremarkable eyes that were suddenly not unremarkable at all because there was something in them now, something that didn't match the slight frame and the quiet demeanor, something hard and certain and completely unafraid. She touched her left shoulder, a gesture so subtle that most people missed it, just her fingers brushing the fabric of her uniform where her sleeve covered her upper arm, and then she straightened, her posture shifting in a way that was impossible to describe but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever served under fire, a settling into readiness that came from muscle memory and training so deep it bypassed conscious thought. "Sir," she said, and her voice hadn't changed volume but somehow it carried more weight. "I understand your experience and I respect it, but I'm not offering an opinion, I'm reporting a tactical reality. That route is a death trap, and if you send men through it, you'll lose them." The directness of it, the flatness of the statement, sent a ripple through the room, because lieutenants don't talk to colonels like that, don't make absolute declarations, don't stand their ground when they've been told to back down. And Hendrix's face flushed red, his jaw tightening in a way that said this had gone from annoying to insubordinate. "Lieutenant Chun, you're out of line," he said, his voice hard now, command voice, the voice that expected immediate compliance. "Return to your seat, we'll discuss your conduct after this briefing." It should have ended there, should have been the moment when she backed down, apologized, retreated into the safety of protocol and rank structure. But Sarah had spent too many years watching good men die because someone senior was too proud to listen, had buried too many friends whose deaths could have been prevented if someone had just paid attention to the person with the right information instead of the person with the right rank. And she wasn't going to let it happen again, not here, not when she could stop it. "Sir, before I sit down, would you allow me to show you one thing?" she asked, and something in her tone, something in the absolute confidence of it, made Hendricks pause, made him curious despite his anger, because there was no fear in her, no nervousness, just certainty. And that kind of certainty from a junior officer was unusual enough to warrant 30 more seconds of attention. "Make it quick," he said, and Sarah nodded once. A sharp dip of her chin that was almost military bearing but not quite, something more precise than that, and she moved to the digital display, her movements economical and sure, pulling up a different map layer, this one showing topographical elevation with gradient shading that revealed what the flat tactical display had hidden. "This is the same area, showing elevation change," she said, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced ease, zooming in on checkpoint Delta. "See this depression here and here?" She pointed to two areas that looked insignificant on the tactical display but showed as deep cuts on the topographical map. "These are seasonal watercourses. They drain the entire northwestern valley system, and right now, based on temperature data and snowpack measurements from the past 3 weeks, there's approximately 40,000 cubic meters of water moving through this system every 6 hours. She pulled up another screen, this one showing rainfall and temperature data, and then another showing historical flood patterns, and the officers around the table started leaning forward now, their attention caught not by her rank or her gender but by the sheer precision of what she was presenting. 3 weeks ago, I was part of a 4-person team that walked this route," she continued, and she didn't mention that she'd led that team, didn't say that she'd been the one who chose the route and set the pace and made the calls that got them there and back safely, just kept her language neutral and factual. "We measured water depth at this crossing point," she indicated a spot on the map, "and it was 46 inches deep, with a current velocity of 8 knots, that's unpassable on foot without rope systems, and the banks are too unstable for vehicle crossing. We watched a boulder the size of a small car get moved 15 meters downstream in under a minute." She zoomed out slightly, showing the entire valley system. "If you insert here like you're planning, your team will reach this point about 90 minutes into the movement. It'll be dark, they'll be carrying full combat loads, and they'll hit that water crossing with no warning because it's not visible on thermal imaging and it doesn't show up on ground-penetrating radar because the water's too shallow to register. But it's deep enough and fast enough to sweep a man off his feet. And once you're in that current, you get pushed downstream into this area." She highlighted a section of the map that showed narrow canyon walls, where the water accelerates and drops 6 meters over the course of 30 meters. It's basically a natural waterfall, and there's no egress point for 200 meters past that, which means if anyone goes in, they're not coming out not alive. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone staring at the map, seeing what she'd laid out, the clear and undeniable danger that their original route would have led directly into, and Colonel Hendricks had gone very still, his face no longer red with anger but pale with the realization of what had almost happened. Captain Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the silence with a question that everyone was thinking. "Lieutenant Chun, how did your team cross it?" he asked, and Sarah turned to face him, her expression neutral. "We didn't, sir. We assessed that it was too dangerous, so we moved north, added 4 clicks to the route but found a bridge structure, old Soviet engineering, still intact. It's not on any current maps because it's partially collapsed on the eastern end, but it's passable on foot, and it puts you in position for the objective with a much safer approach." She pulled up another map layer, showing the alternative route, her fingers moving with absolute confidence across the display. And as she talked through the modified plan, explaining sight lines and concealment and timing, something started to shift in the room, a growing awareness that this wasn't just some lieutenant making suggestions. This was someone who knew exactly what she was talking about, who had the kind of detailed, ground-level intelligence that only came from actually being there, and more than that, who had the tactical sense to know what that intelligence meant for mission planning. But there was still a question hanging in the air, unspoken but obvious in every face that watched her. Who was this woman, really, and where had she learned to brief tactical operations like someone who'd done this hundreds of times, with the calm authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak with certainty? Colonel Hendricks stood there for a long moment, his mind clearly working through what he'd just seen, weighing his pride against the lives of the men he'd be sending into that valley. And to his credit, when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge of anger, replaced by something more careful, more thoughtful. "Lieutenant, your alternative route adds significant time to the approach," he said, and it was a statement but also a question, an opening for her to defend her suggestion. "Yes, sir, approximately 90 minutes, she replied without hesitation. "But it keeps the team dry, maintains operational security because you're not creating noise and movement trying to negotiate a water obstacle, and it positions you with better sight lines on the objective. The original route would have put you in a depression where you'd be looking up at the target building, The bridge route puts you at the same elevation, which gives you tactical advantage if things go sideways. She was speaking his language now, talking about the things that mattered to an infantry officer, tactical advantage in security and positioning, and Hendricks nodded slowly, his arms uncrossing, his posture becoming less defensive. "Show me the bridge," he said, and Sarah pulled up a series of photographs, not satellite shots but ground-level images that showed the structure from multiple angles, clearly taken during her reconnaissance. And there in the photos you could see members of her team for scale, 3 men in full kit standing near the bridge supports, and if you looked closely, if you knew what you were looking for, you might have noticed that those men moved with a particular kind of precision, carried their weapons with a specific kind of comfort that marked them as something more than average soldiers. The briefing room's dynamic had completely changed now. Officers were standing, moving closer to the display to get a better look at what Sarah was showing them, asking questions about elevation and distances and timing, and she answered each one with the same calm precision, never hesitating, never guessing, always certain, because she'd been there, she'd seen it, she'd measured it and recorded it and analyzed it, and this was what she did. This was her job. Except it wasn't supposed to be her job, not according to her official assignment orders, not according to what lieutenants typically do at forward operating bases. And that discrepancy was starting to register with some of the sharper officers in the room. Captain Rodriguez, who'd served at Fort Bragg before this deployment, who'd spent time around special operations units, was looking at her with an expression that had moved past respect into something like recognition, like he was putting pieces together in his mind and not quite believing the picture they formed. The 2-star general in the back corner, who hadn't spoken throughout the entire briefing, pushed off from the wall where he'd been leaning and moved closer, his eyes not on the map but on Sarah, studying her with the intensity of someone who'd spent a career reading people and situations. "Lieutenant," he said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone else stop talking and turn to listen. "You said you conducted this reconnaissance 3 weeks ago. What unit were you attached to for that operation?" It was a simple question, straightforward, the kind of thing that should have a simple answer, but Sarah hesitated for the first time since she'd started speaking, and that hesitation was more telling than any words could have been. She looked at the general, really looked at him, and something passed between them, an understanding that came from shared experience, from having operated in the same world even if not at the same time, and she made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of this briefing. "Sir, that operation was conducted under different operational security protocols," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "I'd need to discuss the specifics in a classified setting." The general's eyebrows rose slightly, and around the room, officers exchanged glances because what she'd just said, the way she'd said it, that wasn't how lieutenants talked about reconnaissance patrols. That was how intelligence operatives talked about sensitive missions, and suddenly the questions weren't about the map anymore. They were about her, about who she was and what she'd been doing for the past 6 months and why none of them had really noticed her until this moment. Colonel Hendricks had gone very quiet, his earlier anger completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked like calculation mixed with a growing unease, because he was starting to realize that he'd just spent 10 minutes dismissing someone he should have been listening to, someone who clearly had capabilities and clearances that exceeded his own. And that kind of mistake, made in front of a 2-star general, was the kind of thing that showed up in fitness reports and career progression notes. The general nodded slowly, accepting her non-answer as answer enough, and he turned to Hendricks with an expression that was professionally neutral, but carried an undercurrent of something sharper. "Colonel, I think we should take the lieutenant's recommendation on the route modification," he said, and it was phrased as a suggestion, but everyone in the room knew it was an order. The kind of order that came from someone who'd seen enough combat to know that pride was a luxury you couldn't afford when lives were at stake. "Yes, sir," Hendricks replied immediately, his voice tight but professional, and he turned to Sarah with an expression that was complicated, part resentment, part respect, part confusion. "Lieutenant Chun, thank you for your input. We'll implement your alternative route. Please coordinate with the operations officer to update all relevant materials." But the general wasn't done. He moved closer to the display, his eyes scanning the detailed topographical data that Sarah had pulled up, and then he looked at her with the kind of direct assessment that came from decades of evaluating personnel. "Lieutenant, your reconnaissance team, how many personnel?" he asked, and again it was a simple question with layers underneath it, because the size and composition of a recon team told you a lot about its purpose and capability. "4, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "And you led that team?" The general pressed, and there it was, the question that was really being asked: who was in charge, who made the calls, who had the authority to conduct that kind of deep reconnaissance in hostile territory. "I had tactical command, yes sir," she said, and the way she phrased it, tactical command rather than just led, that was another piece of professional language that marked her as someone with specialized training, because tactical command implied a level of authority and responsibility that went beyond just being the senior person on patrol. The general smiled, a small expression that didn't reach his eyes but conveyed satisfaction, like he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. "And where did you learn tactical reconnaissance, Lieutenant?" he asked. And the room went silent again, everyone waiting for her answer. Because this was the question that mattered. This was where they'd find out who she really was and what she was really doing at this forward operating base, pretending to be just another junior intelligence officer. Sarah stood there at the front of the briefing room, every eye on her, and she knew she was at a crossroads, knew that what she said next would either explain everything or create more questions, and she had to make a judgment call about what was appropriate to reveal in this setting, with this audience, at this moment. She touched her shoulder again, that same subtle gesture, and then she made her decision. "Sir, I attended the Special Operations Target Interdiction course at Harvey Point," she said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, like she was discussing where she'd gone to college, not revealing that she'd completed one of the most classified and demanding training programs in the United States military, a course that only a handful of personnel attend each year, most of them from special mission units, and almost none of them junior officers, and absolutely none of them, in the 15-year history of the program, women. The room's silence took on a different quality, a stunned quality, because what she just said didn't compute with what they were seeing, didn't match the slight frame and the quiet demeanor and the lieutenant's bars, and every officer in that room was trying to reconcile the information with their preconceptions and finding that the pieces didn't fit. Harvey Point wasn't a place you talked about, wasn't a facility that showed up on official training records. It was where the military and intelligence community sent people who needed skills that couldn't be taught anywhere else, advanced reconnaissance and surveillance and direct action capabilities that went beyond what conventional special operations provided. And if you'd been to Harvey Point, if you'd completed the SOTIC program, that meant you were either special forces or working for an agency that most people assumed was fictional, and either way, you weren't supposed to be standing in a briefing room at a forward operating base in Afghanistan wearing lieutenant's bars and taking notes in the back row. Colonel Hendricks looked like someone had just punched him in the stomach, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to read, and around the table, officers were leaning back in their chairs, their body language shifting from dismissive to respectful, from superior to uncertain, because they'd all just realized that they'd been completely wrong about who she was, and that kind of realization was uncomfortable and disorienting, and made you question what else you might be wrong about. Captain Rodriguez actually laughed, a short bark of sound that was more surprise than humor, and he shook his head slowly. "Holy shit," he muttered, quiet enough that it might have been to himself, and the lieutenant next to him, a young woman named Martinez who'd barely looked at Sarah throughout the entire briefing, was staring now with an expression of absolute shock mixed with something that might have been inspiration, or might have been dismay at how thoroughly she'd misjudged the quiet intelligence officer who'd been sitting in their briefings for 6 months without saying much of anything. But there was more to this story, more that needed to be said, because Harvey Point explained the skills, but it didn't explain why she was here, why someone with that training and capability was assigned to a forward operating base as a junior intelligence officer instead of operating with a special mission unit, and the general, who clearly knew more than he was saying, who'd probably known from the moment she'd started talking exactly who and what she was, decided that the room needed more context. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice carrying that tone of formal recognition that preceded a revelation. "Perhaps you should tell these officers what you were doing before you arrived at FOB Lightning. Give them the complete picture." Sarah looked at the general for a long moment, and you could see her weighing what was appropriate, what was necessary, what would serve the mission versus what would just satisfy curiosity. And when she spoke, her voice had a different quality. Not harder exactly, but more distant, like she was talking about someone else's life rather than her own. "Prior to this assignment, I served as a training cadre member at the Naval Special Warfare Center," she said, and she let that sentence hang there for a moment, let them process what it meant, and then she continued, "Specifically, I was an instructor for advanced land navigation and small unit tactics for SEAL qualification training. I ran that program for 3 years, and during that time, I trained 11 teams through their final certification cycle. That's 66 operators total, 11 of whom have since made it through DevGru selection." DevGru Development Group, the name that had replaced SEAL Team 6 in official parlance, the Tier 1 unit that took the best of the best and made them better, and she trained 11 men who'd gone on to make that cut, which meant she trained them so well that they'd stood out even among the elite, and more than that, it meant that she'd been given the authority and responsibility to determine whether prospective SEALs were ready for the teams, which was a level of trust and recognition that didn't come from political correctness or affirmative action. It came from being so undeniably competent that the teams themselves, the most exclusive and demanding organization in the military, had looked at her and said, "Yes, this person can teach our people. This person meets our standards. This person is one of us." The room had gone from quiet to silent to something beyond silent, a kind of vacuum where sound existed but nobody was making any, and every person there was reevaluating everything they thought they knew about Lieutenant Sarah Chun, replaying every interaction, every briefing, every moment when they dismissed her or ignored her or failed to take her seriously, and feeling the weight of their assumptions land like physical things. Colonel Hendricks looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him, his earlier confidence completely shattered, his authority suddenly seeming fragile and uncertain in the face of someone who'd done things he'd only read about in classified briefings. The captain from earlier, Rodriguez, who'd worked with special operations units, was nodding slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind, because he knew what it meant to train SEALs, knew the kind of selection process that went into becoming an instructor at that level, knew that you couldn't fake your way into that position or politic your way there. You had to earn it by being better than almost everyone around you. And if she'd done it for 3 years, if she'd successfully run 11 teams through certification, then she wasn't just good, she was exceptional in ways that most officers would never be. The general, who'd orchestrated this revelation, looked satisfied in a grim sort of way, like he'd just taught a lesson that needed to be taught, a lesson about assumptions and respect and the dangers of underestimating people based on what they looked like rather than what they could do. "So gentlemen," he said, addressing the room but looking at Hendricks, "when Lieutenant Chun tells you that a route is dangerous, when she provides tactical recommendations based on ground reconnaissance, I suggest you listen, because she's forgotten more about small unit operations than most of you will ever learn. And the men she's trained are currently conducting the most sensitive operations in the most dangerous places in the world, which means her standards are higher than yours, her knowledge is deeper than yours, and her judgment is proven in ways that your rank and experience, while valuable, simply aren't." It was a rebuke, polite and professional but unmistakable, directed at Hendricks but really meant for everyone in the room. A reminder that the military's strength came from its ability to recognize and utilize talent wherever it existed, regardless of whether it came in the package you expected, and that leaders who let their biases override good intelligence deserved neither their position nor their authority. Hendricks, to his credit, didn't try to defend himself, didn't make excuses, just nodded slowly and turned to Sarah with an expression that had moved from defensive to genuinely apologetic. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice formal and careful, "I owe you an apology. My conduct was unprofessional, and more importantly, it was tactically unsound. Thank you for persisting despite my resistance. You may have saved lives today." It was a good apology, sincere and specific, the kind that acknowledged the mistake without trying to minimize it, and Sarah accepted it with a small nod. No triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at being vindicated, just professional acknowledgement that they could now move forward. "Thank you, sir," she said simply. And then she turned back to the map, all business again, ready to continue the briefing and get the mission planned correctly. And that more than anything else, that immediate return to the work without dwelling on the drama, that showed who she was, showed that she wasn't here for recognition or respect or to prove anything. She was here to do a job, and the job was making sure that operations were planned well and executed safely, and that the people who went outside the wire came back alive. The rest of the briefing proceeded with a completely different energy, officers asking Sarah's opinion on multiple aspects of the plan, deferring to her judgment on route selection and timing and risk assessment, and she answered every question with the same calm competence, never grandstanding, never using her revealed background as a weapon, just providing information and analysis and letting the facts speak for themselves. The two-star general stayed for the entire briefing, which was unusual enough that everyone noticed, and several times he nodded in approval as Sarah walked through tactical considerations, clearly satisfied with both her performance and the lesson that had been taught. When the briefing finally ended, 2 hours after it had started, officers filed out with their updated plans and a new understanding of who was actually in their midst, and more than a few of them stopped by Sarah's position to thank her or ask follow-up questions or simply acknowledge that they'd learned something important today. Captain Rodriguez waited until most of the room had cleared, and then approached her with a rueful smile. "Lieutenant, I owe you a beer and an apology," he said, and Sarah smiled, a real smile that made her look even younger for a moment. "No apology needed, sir. You asked good questions during the briefing. That's what matters." Rodriguez shook his head. "I should have backed you up when Hendricks shut you down. I saw the same problems you did, but didn't have the guts to say anything. That's on me." Sarah's expression became more serious. "That's the system, Captain. It's not personal, it's structural. And the only way to change it is to keep showing up and keep speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." Colonel Hendricks was the last to leave, and he paused at the door, looking back at Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read. "Lieutenant," he said, and she turned to face him, her posture relaxed but attentive. "I'm curious about something. You've been here for 6 months, attended dozens of briefings, and this is the first time you've spoken up like this. Why now?" It was a fair question, and Sarah considered it for a moment before answering. "Because this is the first time I've had information that was critical enough to warrant the fight, sir," she said honestly. "I can live with people underestimating me. I can live with being dismissed. What I can't live with is staying quiet when I know men are about to walk into danger that could be avoided. That's where my line is, that's where it's always been. Hendricks nodded slowly, and something in his face said he understood, maybe even respected it. For what it's worth, he said, you were right to push back, and I was wrong to dismiss you. I'll remember this briefing for a long time. Sarah gave him a small smile. That's all any of us can do, sir. Learn from the experience and do better next time. After he left, Sarah stood alone in the empty briefing room, the map still glowing on the digital display, showing the corrected route that would keep 12 men safe during their mission, and she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, not for being proven right, not for the vindication or the apologies, but for the simple fact that she'd done her job. She'd used her knowledge and training and experience to make a difference, and that was what mattered. That was what all of it, all the training and the sacrifice and the years of proving herself over and over again, that was what it was for. But to understand how Sarah Chun ended up in that briefing room, to understand how a slight woman in her late 20s became someone who trained Navy SEALs and conducted classified reconnaissance missions and spoke with absolute authority about tactical operations, you have to go back to a different time and place, to a moment when she was standing in front of a different group of men who underestimated her, men who would eventually become some of the most dangerous operators in the world, but who started as skeptical candidates looking at their new instructor and seeing everything she wasn't. She wasn't male, wasn't tall, wasn't physically imposing, wasn't any of the things they expected from someone who was supposed to teach them advanced tactics. It was 2019, early morning at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California, and Sarah was 25 years old, 3 years out of West Point where she'd graduated in the top 5% of her class, 2 years past her completion of Ranger School where she'd been one of the first women to earn the tab, and 6 months beyond her graduation from the Special Operations Target Interdiction course where she'd finished second in her class despite being 40 pounds lighter than anyone else in the program. She'd been recruited for the instructor position by a captain named Morrison, who'd seen her performance at SOTIC and recognized that she had not just the skills but the temperament to teach others, the patience and precision and unshakable competence that made great instructors great. And he'd gone out on a limb to bring her to Coronado because he believed that having diverse perspectives in training made better operators, not because of politics but because different approaches and different problem-solving methods created more adaptable teams. But Morrison's belief wasn't shared by everyone, and when Sarah walked into her first class, when she stood in front of 24 men who'd already survived Beauty/S, who'd already proven themselves among the toughest in the military, she could feel the resistance, could see it in the crossed arms and skeptical expressions and the whispered conversations that stopped when she stepped to the front of the room. She didn't blame them exactly because she understood that their skepticism came from experience, came from years in a world where physical capability and combat experience were the only currencies that mattered, and she was an unknown quantity, someone who looked like she'd be more at home in a library than on a battlefield, and they had a right to wonder whether she could teach them anything they didn't already know. But Sarah had learned early in her career that you couldn't argue your way into respect, couldn't convince people with words that you were capable. You had to show them, had to demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that you met the standard, and then you had to do it again and again until it became undeniable. So she didn't start with her credentials, didn't list her qualifications or training, didn't try to justify her presence. She just picked up a topographical map, spread it on the table at the front of the room and said, "Gentlemen, you have 5 minutes to plan a 3-man reconnaissance approach to this target. You're inserting from the north. Objective is a compound at these coordinates. I need primary and alternate routes, insertion and extraction plans, rally points, and risk assessment. Go." The room hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, men exchanging glances, trying to figure out if this was a test or a joke, and then instinct took over, training kicked in, and they moved to the table, started talking through the problem, pointing at features on the map, debating approaches, working through the tactical puzzle the way they'd been trained to do. Sarah watched in silence, her eyes tracking their discussion, noting who led, who deferred, who asked smart questions, who jumped to conclusions, building a mental model of how this team functioned. And when 5 minutes elapsed, she called time and asked them to brief their plan. A tall guy named Peterson, who clearly was the alpha of the group, stepped forward and ran through their approach, and it was good, solid, exactly what you'd expect from men who'd been through this training before, textbook perfect and completely conventional. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she nodded once. "Good plan," she said. "It'll get you to the objective and back safely, assuming everything goes according to expectations." She paused. "Now let me show you what would actually happen." She pulled up a satellite image of the area, overlaid their planned route, and started pointing out problems, not hypotheticals but specific, observable issues that they'd missed. "This wadi you're using for concealment, it looks perfect on the topo map, but if you pull actual ground photos, you can see that local nationals use it as a goat path. There's livestock moving through here multiple times a day, which means your movement will leave traces that anyone with tracking experience will spot immediately." She zoomed in. "Your primary rally point is in this depression, good terrain for concealment, but look at the vegetation patterns, see how it missed. This wadi you're using for concealment, it looks perfect on the topo map, But if you pull actual ground photos, you can see that local nationals use it as a goat path. There's livestock moving through here multiple times a day, which means your movement will leave traces that anyone with tracking experience will spot immediately. She zoomed in. Your primary rally point is in this depression, good terrain for concealment, but look at the vegetation patterns. See how everything's greener here? That's because water collects in this area, which means the ground is soft, which means you'll leave tracks, and more importantly, which means you'll be dealing with insects, specifically sandflies and mosquitoes, which means noise and distraction at exactly the moment when you need to be silent and focused. She continued through their entire plan, identifying flaw after flaw, not fundamental mistakes but small oversights that could cascade into mission failure. The kind of details that only became obvious when you'd actually been on the ground in similar environments and learned from experience what mattered. By the time she finished, the 24 men were paying attention in a completely different way, leaning forward, taking notes, asking questions, because what she was teaching them wasn't theory, wasn't classroom knowledge, it was practical, hard-won understanding of how missions actually unfolded in the real world. So how would you do it? Peterson asked, and his tone had changed, less challenging now, more genuinely curious, and Sarah smiled. I'd approach from the east, not the north. It's an extra 2 kilometers, but it puts you in terrain that's less trafficked. I'd move at midday rather than night because thermal camouflage is less effective than visual camouflage in this environment, and you're less likely to encounter locals during the heat of the day. And I'd plan for a 72-hour observation period rather than 48, because rushing the reconnaissance phase is how you miss the patterns that tell you when the target is vulnerable. She pulled up a different route on the map, walked them through every decision point, explained the reasoning behind each choice, and by the end of it, every man in that room understood that she wasn't there because of politics or affirmative action or any reason except that she was better at this than they were. And if they wanted to survive and succeed in the field, they needed to learn what she had to teach. That first class was the template for the 3 years that followed, Sarah teaching advanced land navigation and small unit tactics to some of the most elite operators in the military, earning their respect not through authority but through demonstrated competence, showing them new ways to think about problems, challenging their assumptions, pushing them to be better than they thought they could be. She ran navigation courses where she dropped teams in unfamiliar terrain with minimal equipment and expect them to reach objectives miles away using only map and compass and terrain association. And she'd be there at every checkpoint, having arrived hours earlier by a faster route that she'd identified through pure skill, waiting with a stopwatch and a knowing smile. She taught them how to read landscapes, how to identify microterrain features that provided concealment, how to move through open ground without being detected, how to think 3 moves ahead of any potential adversary. And more than the tactical skills, she taught them to think, really think about every decision, to question their assumptions, to plan for failure modes, to always have a backup plan and a backup for the backup. The 11 men who went on to DevGru, who made it through the Tier 1 selection process, they all credited Sarah with teaching them how to think like special operators rather than just perform like them, how to approach missions with a level of analytical rigor that separated the competent from the exceptional. But teaching at Coronado wasn't easy, wasn't something she could just show up and do. It required constant proof, constant demonstration that she belonged, because every new class brought new skepticism, new challenges, new tests of her capability and her resolve. She got used to the looks, the doubted questions, the careful distance that men maintained when they weren't sure whether to treat her as an instructor or as a curiosity, and she learned to push through it, to focus on the work rather than the politics, to measure her success not by whether people liked her but by whether her students survived and succeeded when they deployed. There were moments of connection too, breakthrough moments when a student would come to her after a particularly challenging exercise and say something like, "I get it now, I see what you were trying to teach us." And those moments made everything else worth it, made the doubts and the challenges and the constant pressure to prove herself seem like a reasonable price to pay for the privilege of making a difference in the lives of men who put themselves in harm's way. One of her students, a young SEAL candidate named Mitchell who later died in a training accident, told her once that she taught him more about being a professional soldier in 12 weeks than he'd learned in his previous 6 years of service. Not because she was showing him new skills, but because she was showing him new ways to think about the skills he already had. And that conversation, that acknowledgement from someone who'd never planned to respect a female instructor but had come around through sheer exposure to her competence, that stayed with her as a reminder of why this work mattered. After 3 years at Coronado, Sarah had been offered a position at one of the classified agencies, a chance to move from training to active operations, but she turned it down because she'd learned that she was better at teaching than doing, better at developing capability in others than executing missions herself, and there was no shame in that recognition, no admission of inadequacy, just an honest assessment of where she could provide the most value. Instead, she'd taken an assignment to Afghanistan, ostensibly as an intelligence officer at FOB Lightning, but really as an embedded asset, someone with specialized skills who could provide advanced reconnaissance and tactical advice when needed, operating quietly in the background until a situation arose where her capabilities were required. For 6 months, she'd done exactly that, sitting in briefings, taking notes, watching operations, and saying very little, letting people underestimate her because it made her job easier, made it possible to observe and learn without the complications that came from people knowing who and what she was. She'd conducted several reconnaissance missions during that time, always under operational security protocols that kept the details classified, always with small teams of specially selected personnel who understood that she wasn't just a lieutenant but someone with capabilities that exceeded her rank. And those missions had gathered intelligence that had prevented attacks, identified high-value targets, and saved lives, all without any public recognition or official acknowledgement because that was how this work functioned, quietly and without fanfare. And that brought things full circle, back to the briefing room, to the moment when staying quiet would have cost lives and speaking up required putting aside the comfortable anonymity she'd cultivated, required exposing herself to scrutiny and questions and all the complications that came from people knowing the truth. She'd made the right call, she was certain of that, but it meant that her time operating in the shadows at FOB Lightning was probably over, meant that people would treat her differently now, would ask her opinion and defer to her judgment and watch her more closely. And she wasn't sure yet whether that was a positive development or just a new set of challenges to navigate. But those were concerns for later, problems to solve as they arose. Right now, standing in the empty briefing room with the corrected mission plan glowing on the display, she felt the satisfaction of having done her job well, of having used her training and experience to prevent tragedy. And that was enough. That was what she'd signed up for when she'd chosen this path, when she'd decided that serving in the shadows and making a difference without recognition was more important than the glory and respect that came from more conventional military service. 3 days later, the 12-man team executed their mission using Sarah's modified route, crossed the Soviet-era bridge without incident, reached their objective with perfect timing, and completed their operation without casualties. And when they returned to FOB Lightning, the team leader, a grizzled master sergeant with 20 years of service, sought out Sarah in the Intelligence Operations Center where she was reviewing satellite imagery. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice gruff but respectful, "my guys wanted me to thank you. We walked past that ravine you warned about, checked it out of curiosity, and you were right, that crossing would have been impossible. We'd have either aborted the mission or lost people trying to push through, so thank you for knowing your stuff and for having the spine to speak up even when people weren't listening." Sarah looked up from her screen and smiled. "Just doing my job, Master Sergeant. Glad everyone made it back safe." He nodded, started to leave, then paused and turned back. "One of my guys, Jenkins, he was at Coronado in 2020, says you were his land NAV instructor. Says you're the reason he made it through selection. Just thought you should know that you've got people out here who know what you did for them, even if nobody else does." And with that, he left, and Sarah sat there for a moment, feeling the weight and privilege of that acknowledgement, understanding that this was the real measure of her career, not the rank or the recognition or the impressive credentials, but the lives she'd influenced and the people she'd helped become better versions of themselves. The rest of her deployment at FOB Lightning was different after that briefing. Officers sought her opinion more often, included her in planning sessions, treated her with the respect that her experience warranted, and while she appreciated the change, she also missed the anonymity, missed being able to observe without being observed, missed the freedom that came from people not expecting anything from her. Colonel Hendricks, to his credit, became one of her strongest advocates, making sure that her insights were heard and her recommendations were considered, and he never made excuses for his initial dismissal of her, just owned the mistake and worked to be better, which was all anyone could ask. The 2-star general who'd orchestrated her revelation submitted a commendation for her performance, noting her exceptional tactical acumen and her courage in speaking truth to power, and while Sarah appreciated the gesture, she knew that the commendation would sit in a classified file somewhere and never see the light of day because that was how things worked when you operated in the spaces she did. Your achievements were acknowledged privately, celebrated by the people who mattered, but never publicized or made part of your official record. And she was fine with that, had always been fine with it, because she'd learned early in her career that the most important victories were the ones nobody ever heard about, the missions that succeeded because someone had done the unglamorous work of preparation and planning and attention to detail, the lives that were saved because someone had spoken up at the right moment even when it was uncomfortable or dangerous or career-limiting. When her deployment ended and she rotated back to the States, Sarah was offered a promotion and a new assignment, a chance to lead a training program for female special operations candidates, helping to develop the next generation of women who wanted to serve in combat roles. And she accepted because it felt like the natural progression of her career, the next way she could make a difference and use her experience to open doors that had been closed for too long. She thought sometimes about that briefing room, about the moment when she'd stood in front of all those officers and made the choice to reveal who she was, to abandon her anonymity in service of a greater good, and she wondered if she'd do it the same way if given the chance again. The answer was always yes, not because she enjoyed the confrontation or relished proving people wrong, but because the alternative, staying silent and watching men walk into danger, was unacceptable, was a betrayal of everything she'd been trained to do and everything she believed about duty and service and responsibility. The military had taught her many things over her career about tactics and leadership and the importance of preparation, but the most important lesson, the one that stayed with her through all the challenges and doubts and moments of being underestimated, was that competence was its own authority, that if you knew your job and did it well and maintained your standards even when nobody was watching, eventually people would notice, would recognize what you brought to the table, and would give you the opportunity to make a difference. And that's what she'd done. In that briefing room and in countless other moments throughout her career, she'd made a difference. Not through grand gestures or heroic actions, but through quiet competence, through knowing her job and doing it well and refusing to stay silent when silence would cost lives. She trained 11 men who went on to become Tier 1 operators, taught them to think and plan and execute missions with a level of skill that saved lives and accomplished objectives in the most dangerous places in the world. She'd conducted reconnaissance missions that gathered critical intelligence and prevented attacks. She'd stood up in a briefing room and challenged a colonel's tactical plan and been proven right, and in doing so, she'd saved 12 men from walking into a death trap. These weren't the kinds of achievements that made headlines or earned medals that could be worn in public, but they were real, they mattered, they represented lives that continued and missions that succeeded and a military that was stronger because she'd been part of it. And that was enough, that was everything, that was what service meant when you stripped away all the politics and the ceremony and the public recognition. It meant doing the hard work that needed to be done, even when nobody was watching, even when nobody would ever know, because the work itself was reward enough, because the knowledge that you'd made a difference was more valuable than any external validation could ever be. Lieutenant Sarah Chun continued her career, training and teaching and occasionally deploying when her specialized skills were needed, and most people she encountered still underestimated her at first, still saw the slight frame and the quiet demeanor and made assumptions about what she was capable of, and she let them because she'd learned that being underestimated was an advantage, gave you the element of surprise, allowed you to observe and learn while people's guards were down. But every now and then, in a briefing room or a training exercise or a moment of crisis, she'd step forward and demonstrate who she really was, what she was really capable of, and people would be shocked and impressed and would recalibrate their understanding of what was possible. And those moments, while not why she served, were satisfying in their own way. Little reminders that assumptions were dangerous and that respect should be earned through demonstration rather than given based on appearance or rank or gender. She never spoke about the briefing at FOB Lightning, never told the story of how she'd challenged a colonel and been vindicated, because that wasn't her style, wasn't the kind of person she was. But the people who'd been there told the story, passed it along to other officers and soldiers, and it became one of those legends that circulated through military circles, a reminder about the dangers of underestimation and the importance of listening to expertise regardless of where it came from. And maybe that was the real legacy, not the missions or the training or the individual achievements, but the slow, gradual change in how people thought about capability and competence, the growing understanding that talent came in all forms and that the military's strength lay in its ability to recognize and develop that talent wherever it existed. She never needed recognition, never sought validation, never cared about glory or fame or having her name in the history books. She just wanted to do her job well, to make a difference in the lives of the people she served alongside, to know that her work mattered and that she'd lived up to the standards she'd set for herself. And by that measure, by the measure that actually counted, Lieutenant Sarah Chun was successful beyond what most people would ever achieve, because she'd taken her gifts and her training and her experience and used them in service of something larger than herself, had made the military better by being part of it, had made individual soldiers more capable by teaching them, had saved lives by speaking up when it mattered most. And she never spoke of it again, never needed to, because the work spoke for itself, because the men she trained and the missions that succeeded and the lives that were saved were all the testament that mattered, all the proof that was needed that she'd been exactly who she needed to be, exactly when it mattered most. This story is fictional and created to reflect timeless values of honor, service, and respect. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental and unintentional.